Hey, again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Russell Graves. If you've been here before, you know I'm regular at giving these webinars, especially here lately. It seems like I've been giving one about every couple of weeks. If you're new to this webinar format that we do here at Backcountry Journeys, welcome everybody. Glad you made it. And so let's go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Russell Graves. I'm coming to you live right now from my temporary office here in Bonham, Texas, but I'm from Dodge City, Texas, where hopefully by the next webinar, I'll be doing it from my home office there. And if you want to check out what I do, you can check out check out my website at russellgraves.com. Now, why backyard birds? You know, at the first of my photography career, I'd always go out looking for animals. I never would try to concentrate what I had in my own backyard. But up until 2 or 3 or maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I think it was, I started really kind of focusing on birds that were just coming to my backyard, because I've always lived out in the country, and you'd see all kinds of birds just hanging around the house. And so I made it a point to try to start building my portfolio of just nothing but backyard birds. So through this presentation today, I'm going to talk to you about backyard birds and why this first slide here, why you should focus on them. Secondly, I'll give you some strategies on not only how to focus on them from a photography standpoint, but also some biological facts that you can marry with your photography to help increase your success. Third thing, I'm going to show you a short video towards the end to kind of help it all make sense. Before I get going, I've got a question here. Jerry says, not getting audio. Should I leave and try again? Jerry, you might try that. It seems like we're working okay so far. Now, and Jerry brings up a good point. As I go through this today, I want this to be a dialogue and not a monologue. And so, hang on one second. There we go. So as we go through this today, I want this to be a dialogue and not a monologue. So if you have questions, just pop it in the Q&A, and I'll answer them as they come along. So, why backyard birds? Well, it's all pretty simple. Backyard birds are always close to home, you know, and the cool thing about birds is as the seasons change, like right now around my house that we're still in the process of building, that we're getting a whole new set of birds starting to come in. Spring's coming on, winter hopefully is behind us, and then so we're getting a whole new crop of birds. And so as the year goes on, we'll have that same standard group of birds that don't migrate anywhere, but as the year goes on, we'll have more and more birds come into the house, and we'll be able to enjoy them not only just from a bird watching standpoint, but also from a photography standpoint. So that close to home is really important, and I'll tell you why here in just a second. Second thing, they're usually pretty easy to attract. We'll get into some strategies here in a minute on how you can attract more birds, to your backyard, but they're easy to attract generally. They don't need a whole lot of things to be able to get them to come fairly close in your backyard. And this is the reason why that I think it's most important. It's easy to practice on. You know, if you have a constant source of photographic subjects in your own backyard, you don't have to travel far. It doesn't take a lot of effort to get your camera out. And really, whenever I'm leading a workshop or a tour somewhere, one of the things that I talk to people a lot is the importance of practice. I mean, I'm convinced everyone can become a great photographer. The technology and the tools are there for us today to be able to become really, really, really good. But the thing it always takes, like it does in any other activity in which you may partake, it's going to take practice. And so backyard birds, just the ability to practice and practice almost every single day if you want to, that's a great opportunity that backyard birds provide. So before we go any further, a little bit of a biology lesson, and I'm going to break these down of the 5 things that all wildlife species needs to thrive, and you can include yourself in this list as well. And so as I go from here, I'll kind of break down each one of these individually, talk a little bit more about each one individually, and give you a few photography strategies that you can do to take advantage of each one of these 5 things that wildlife needs to thrive. The first one obviously is food. You know, all wildlife, including me and you, we need food to survive. Second thing is water. And these 5 things I'm going to mention, without regard to species, all species of animals need these same things. Cover. I'll get into a little bit more specifics in a minute about cover and what that means. But cover is typically, if we're put in people perspective, cover is the house you live in, or just some way to get out of the weather and be able to survive times of bad weather. You need space. If the pandemic taught us one thing, people talk all the time about being cramped in small areas. We all need space to survive, and wildlife is no different. And then arrangement. So what that means, it's a little more nebulous. The arrangement refers to the way that the first 4 are in relation to one another. And again, all these 5 things is what the basis of this talk is built upon. So we'll get into each one of them one at a time. So the first one, obviously, back to food. And this one kind of goes, you hear in photography circles, you hear various comments on whether or not it's ethical to feed wildlife. Some say it is, some say it's not. I think we can be of benefit to animals if we provide supplemental feed for them. And so you can provide bird seed or hummingbird or like hummingbird feeders. One thing I've never really tried as far as a backyard bird photography is concerned is doing a lot of hummingbird photography, but this year I plan to change that. So if you're in the camp like I am and you think it's okay to feed, and I think it's okay to feed, I think there's a lot of biological reasons that says feeding is acceptable and feeding can be beneficial to wildlife. I'll back up a little bit on this. And there was a famous biologist back in the 40s named Aldo Leopold, and Aldo Leopold was a noted conservationist of his time, and he wrote a book that's seminal to a lot of wildlife, in a lot of wildlife conservation circles, called the Sand County Almanac. And in that book, he argued that the 4 things that were used, or actually 5 things that were used to destroy wildlife populations, can also be used to build them back up again. And those things are the cow, and he talks about how the livestock industry traditionally pushed all the wildlife out in favor of cattle, but you're starting to see some changes on holistic grazing approaches that really kind of make it a place on some of these agricultural lands where livestock and wildlife can coexist. And if you go, the place with which I'm most familiar is Western Texas, and you'll see a whole lot of ranchers who are taking wildlife conservation serious for economic reasons, but they still have cattle to run on their place, and they show models that you can do both successfully. So the cow, the axe, and the axe refers to how we cut timber down. And so modern biology has shown that even with modern timber management and advanced timber management, and taking out select trees, not taking out all the trees, clear cutting, but taking out select trees from an ecosystem, you can actually benefit wildlife species while having a sustainable harvest. So the cow, axe, plow, and the plow refers to plowing, wholesale plowing of the plains used to take place, and all these clear cutting, these river bottoms to be able to plow and plant food, but how the plow can be used to not only increase wildlife populations from planting food and crops that are beneficial to wildlife, but also how, again, sustainable practices can be implemented that actually can feed people and benefit wildlife. So the cow, axe, plow, fire is the 4th one. And fire, again, refers to how fire was suppressed and creates all these ecological problems that I think we see coming home to roost today when fire is suppressed. But fire can be used as a regenerative tool for wildlife. And then the 5th one that was mentioned after the fact, I don't know that Aldo Leopold mentioned it, was the gun, and how historically market hunting was used to the wildlife's detriment. But today, using modern conservation methods, hunting can actually increase wildlife populations. So now, I'm not an advocate, especially if you live in town, from a backyard bird photography standpoint, of 2 of those. Of course, you can't burn in your backyard necessarily, and you can't use a gun or hunt to control wildlife populations. But the same concepts with a cow and axe and plow, and be able to manipulate how your yard is used and how you can manipulate wildlife populations in your own backyard, that's definitely possible. So with that in mind, you can provide food or bird seed like hummingbird feeders. And this is a big thing, and this is one of the things we have in our landscape plan at the new house we're building. You can do garden plantings that attract wildlife. There's all kinds of host of plants that are would not only provide food for wildlife, but also, I mean, birds, but also pollinators and all kinds of other critters that come around. And so towards the end of this presentation, I will share with you a resource that you can look at if you're interested in having one of those backyards that are just maybe not a certified wildlife habitat, but wildlife habitat that attracts all kinds of animals to your backyard. I'll share that link with you towards the end of this presentation. And so there's a couple of strategies you can use to help increase bird populations in your backyard. And so again, this talk today, we're going to talk about strategies to increase birds and wildlife activity in your backyard, which, you know, I'm assuming everyone in the group knows a lot about photography. And so you can marry those two skills together. And we'll talk about some specific strategies as it applies to photography as we get into this a little bit. Now, all these pictures I'm showing you were actually taken all in either my backyard proper or just right on the fringes of my backyard, because in my old house I lived in Northwest Texas, we had our backyard proper that we kept like any other suburban backyard. Although we lived in the country, we kept the grass fairly low and kept it manicured. But as we got further and further away from the house, I let it grow a little bit wilder and wilder. So we had our yard proper just right around our house, but right on the fringes of our yard, I'd really try to manage for wildlife and try to manage for food species that would attract birds. And so all these pictures you see were all taken either right in my backyard or on my backyard proper. And again, I'll show you proof in a minute of how a lot of this worked. So the second thing is you can help wildlife provide in your own you can help provide wildlife in your own backyard to increase the number of animals that come to your backyard is water. And then, like the slide says here, you can provide water on demand for birds. For the example I give, bird baths, bird waters, or backyard ponds. All three are great ways to increase the number of animals you're going to have in your yard, because what you're going to see is not only will birds use it, but also honeybees, which if you've read anything about honeybees these days, their populations are a little bit in trouble because a lot of them are dying off in wholesale, but the honeybees will use it. And all kinds of animals will start to use that water, because water is really one of the limiting factors when it comes to wildlife habitat, not only in places where you get plenty of water, but also the rest of the country. And then this is a key thing: keep the water fresh at all times. And just like on the food, you know, you'll want to keep the food fresh at all times, just like you keep the water fresh at all times. So the more you change it out, the more the wildlife gets acclimated to come and visiting those water sources. So Shelly asked, what's the long-tailed bird? I think the bird you're talking about is in this slide, Shelly. It's in the lower right. That is a scissor-tailed flycatcher. And that's the state bird of Oklahoma, if you didn't know that. But that's a scissor-tailed flycatcher we're looking at there. Let me catch up to where I was. Believe it or not, that picture of the turkey drinking right there, that was in my backyard where I used to live. And what I built there, it can be replicated at my new house, which I plan to do. But I'll show you a little more about that later. And then the third thing we talked about today is cover. And again, gets a little more nebulous in terms of food's pretty easy to understand, water's pretty easy to understand, but what is cover? And so birds need cover for roosting, nesting, and loafing. So of course, different birds nest in different places. Some nest in trees, others nest on the ground. Some may like nesting in rocks. So this is all dependent on the area in which you live, on what birds you have there, in terms of how they roost. But they need cover for nesting, roosting, which is where they're going to sleep. Again, some birds sleep up in trees, other birds may sleep on the ground. And then the third thing, a term you may not have heard of before, but loafing. Just like you need a place to go sit from time to time just to rest for a little bit, birds need that too. And so if you can provide food that checks these boxes for the roosting, nesting, and loafing cover, then you're well on your way. And so one of the key things that I try to do a lot is, this is a good photography point here. You can add loafing cover around your yard so to help them access the food and water they need by just adding perches. And a lot of these pictures that you'll see, well, I'm going to back up a second. So the titmouse in the upper right of this frame, that was actually just a dead tree I'd stuck in the ground and made that perch for them. And Oops, I went too far back. And the scissor-tailed flycatcher there on the lower right, this is kind of nerdy, but I did it anyway. I went and found some old barbed wire, and I made me a perch between two posts that those birds could land on, because I thought it'd be cool to get pictures of birds landing on a barbed wire like that. And so that's, and by doing so, I was able to manipulate my background, because if you heard me talk before about any kind of wildlife photography, I really try to pay attention to the backgrounds. And so by putting that wire where I wanted it to, I could take advantage of the morning and evening light and be able to put the background where I need it to. And, you know, you can do a technique like this, whether it's a dead limb or whether it's a piece of barbed wire or really anything else. You can do that in just about any backyard, I would imagine. And so by adding that wire, that's what I did, is I added it for loafing cover. So when those birds would, you know, if I had a feeder out, when those birds would go to feed on the feeder, they'd always fly away and just sit nearby to let other birds have their turn, number one, but number two, just to kind of to not digest their feed, because different birds digest their feed in different way. But for example, like chickens will eat a bunch of feed up at one time. Chickens aren't wildlife, of course, but give you an example of a bird that you know. Turkeys do the same thing. They'll eat up a bunch of feed at one time, and then they'll have to go rest for a second because it goes into a body part called the craw, and then that's where they store it in the craw. Then they start the digestion process once it's in the craw. And to do that, they just have to go sit somewhere for a while. And so by providing that loafing cover, whether it's artificial limbs you put in place or limbs that you bring in, or whether it's a piece of barbed wire fence or something else, just gives them a place to rest when they're not actively feeding. And then there, I mentioned it again, that perches can be made of all kinds of stuff. Old fence posts, rocks, any other kind of natural material that will really enhance the pictures you're trying to take. I know I've seen pictures on the webinars of people taking backyard bird photos, and they're great photos, but one way they can always be improved if the bird is sitting on something natural. And so by providing some kind of cover like that in your backyard, whether you're going to try to do a whole scale landscape plan and change your landscaping to really adapt and to be beneficial to wildlife, or whether you're just adding perches for them to sit on, think about that. Think about adding your own perches, and think about the natural aspect and how you want your picture to ultimately look, and think about the backgrounds. And that way you can put perches where you want them, create the kind of backgrounds that you think you'd like to have, and then be able to shoot pictures as those birds land on those spots and then fly off. This is kind of a lazy way to do it, but one of the things I've started doing is having a single perch near a feeder, and I'll pre-focus my lens on it and just sit there and take a picture with a remote control while I'm doing something else. Anytime a bird lands on that, and that way I don't have to necessarily look through the camera. I can just remotely fire my camera. Pat says, that's a beautiful colored bird. Does anyone know what that is? What kind of bird that is, by the way? I'll give you a couple of seconds to chime in. I don't know how common they are across the rest of the state, but these are pretty common in Texas. I mean, across the rest of the country, but these are pretty common in Texas in the spring. I'll go ahead and spill the beans on it since no one's answering. It's a painted bunting, and again, just a beautiful bird, as you can see. And then the fourth thing wildlife needs is they need space. You know, we talked about earlier, just like us, we need food, water, cover. So we need food to eat every day. We need water to eat every day, and we need cover to keep us out of the elements. And so we need all that stuff in a space that gives us plenty of room to feel comfortable around. And different birds, again, I talk about this generally just because I don't know where everybody lives, and each place, like someone mentioned, that don't have those in the Northeast on the painted buntings. Pat mentioned that. And just like you don't have those birds in the Northeast, I've got to talk about birds in general, because I don't know what birds everybody has. And so each area has different birds, and then in those areas, each bird has different space requirements in terms of what makes them feel comfortable. Now, I think it's unreasonable to think that if you provide all these habitat elements for birds in your own backyard, that you're going to attract just every bird that's around in your area, but you will attract more. But in some of the reasons, maybe you may provide food and water, the food they need and the water that they need, and you may provide the cover they need, but they may not have the space. They may just feel uncomfortable in such a confined area of what your backyard may be. And again, it's the amount of physical space that each species requires to thrive. You know, I use turkeys a lot as an example because I probably know more about turkeys than just about any other species of wildlife, but turkeys need that, you know, especially out west where I used to live in northwest Texas, Rio Grande turkeys, they need about probably 3 or 4 square miles to survive. That's the space requirement for them. An English sparrow, on the other hand, may only need a couple thousand square feet to survive. And so each bird species has a different space requirement. And so if you can keep that in mind as you're designing your backyard habitats, you'll undoubtedly increase the number of bird species you have in your backyard. And then, you know, ultimately you can't do much about the space requirements, particularly regarding migrating birds. Well, all you can do there is provide food, water, cover, and then just provide them a stopover place as they come through migrating. Like the painted bunting, I'd only see those about a month and a half out of every year. And so all I really hope to do is not keep them there, but just slow them down long enough when they're coming through my area that I could get some good photographs of them. You know, there's a couple of bird species that come to mind that I would see in my area, and I never could figure out how to make them slow down enough. But one was where I used to live a couple of years ago. One was the Oriole species, beautiful orange bird, orange and black, and I try every year to get photographs of those things and just never could. And then last year, I discovered on my new property I bought, where our house hopefully is finished this week and we'll be moving in next week. I started seeing painted buntings late in the spring and early in the summer, and I kept trying to get pictures of those things either, but could never make them slow down long enough to get them. So some birds you just can't do much about, and in that case, you just enjoy seeing them and enjoy spending time in their close proximity and learning more about them as they pass through. And again, so the robin there on the left, you can see that's kind of at the edges of my yard where it starts to get a little wild. And that picture there that's an artificial roost that was brought in for them to land on. And then again, the rock on the sparrow on the right, as well as the post on the cardinal on the right, they were all brought in. And I think if you can tell, you're starting to see a pattern. I like those really, really clean backgrounds. And so I would always think about where I wanted my perches to be in order to get those backgrounds. And then Heather says, I know that the distance from the bird affects the bokeh. You have beautiful bokeh. Approximately what kind of distance to the background that you have? I'll try to explain this. I've included this information on a couple of webinars I did in the past. It is not in this one. But in general, if you can understand this concept, to get those really out of focus backgrounds, you have to have a background that's relatively far away from the subject, and then the subject relatively close to your camera. So the closer that the subject moves to the background, the less out of focus the background is going to be. And so the distance on the background for these, as long as I didn't have a tree or something else, or some other kind of object sticking up within the 10 or 15 feet behind the birds, it would kind of give me the out of focus highlights I wanted. Typically, what you're looking at, say, for example, of the cardinal there, that background there may be probably, I don't know, 50 yards away till kind of the rest of the grassland starts. And these may be little bitty pockets, isolated pockets of a clearing through the trees that you could see. And I'll talk in a little bit about how you can improve your backgrounds, even if you have a limited amount of space that you're working with. And so, again, to get these backgrounds like this, it's a function of how close your subject is to your lens. Or it's actually 3 things. It's the kind of lens you use, because it's hard to get backgrounds like this when you're using a wide angle lens, but you can do it with the 200 millimeter lens and up. So it's the kind of lens you use, the distance between your subject and the lens, and then the distance between the subject and the background. And that's an easy concept to practice. On one of the last webinars, I'd mentioned that if you go get a little stuffed animal, a teddy bear of some kind, and set it on your back deck or something, and then just move it around and see how keep your aperture on your camera the same. Use a 200 or 300 millimeter lens and just move it around to see how the distance from the stuffed animal to the background, how when it changes, it affects the background highlights that you get. So Heather, I hope that answers that question. And then arrangement, that's the last habitat requirement that we talked about. So food, water, cover, space, and then the last one is arrangement. And arrangement is the relation of food, water, cover to one another. And then if as long as it's within this prescribed space. If you think about it, every one of us, like I go to a local store in town called Brookshire's that's for groceries when we go grocery shopping. And the reason is the arrangement of that store where we get our food as a family is a lot handier than to go to a Kroger that's 35 or 40 miles away in another town. And so, or the restaurants we choose to eat at most of the time are closer to our house or closer to our cover than what some other restaurant that maybe we could drive all the way to Dallas and eat it someplace down there would be. And so the arrangement refers to those those first three: food, water, cover, and the relation to one another. And wildlife are just like us. They want to be able to get to food and water and back to cover in the most efficient manner possible. Because for us, it's a matter of convenience. For wildlife species, it's a matter of life and death, especially when you're a little bird about that tall and everything in the world is trying to eat you. You're at the bottom of the food chain. You need to have food and water that's fairly close to cover. And so you can manipulate those things. You can move them around. Remember, we talked about the things that were used to destroy wildlife can enhance them, and that was the axe, cow, plow, and fire and gun. And although we admit we can't use the fire and gun in our own backyard, but the concepts of the axe and being able to plant trees in a certain place and maybe remove brush from another place to improve the arrangement, you can actually do that. And then the cow and the plow, manipulating the land use and how in introducing food-bearing plants to the landscape can help that arrangement quite a bit. And doing something like that, I've started some rudimentary work, not only on my own backyard, but my property in general. And I'm already starting to see, at least anecdotally, the number of wildlife species going up because I'm making things more handy for them. I'm making things where it's easy for them to go from their loafing or their roosting or their nesting cover to find food or to find water. And a lot of times it's just a simple case of not doing a lot of wholesale plantings or not doing a lot of wholesale habitat manipulations. It's just providing food and water. And so once you can start providing that in an arrangement that satisfies wildlife, you're automatically going to see a whole lot more animals. And then I say here, each species is different in the terms of the arrangement, but there's also a lot of overlap too. So cardinals and mockingbirds and say the painted buntings may have some slightly different arrangement requirements, but it overlaps enough where if you provide just the basics for a number of animals, you're going to have a lot of animals come around because there's going to be enough overlap in their arrangement requirements where you'll have multiple animals using it. And, we talk about birds, but the truth is if you start managing intensely for one species, there's a carryover where you benefit other species as well. In the physical sense, we're taught that Newton's third law of motion, that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And that's true in the physical sense. But in the natural sense, for every reaction that you provide, whether good or bad, there's many reactions that reverberate from that. And so if you were to provide food and water and a good, reliable source of food and water for one species of wildlife, you're going to benefit a whole lot of other species of wildlife too, not only from other birds, but also mammals and also all the bugs and stuff that help keep this grand food web alive. And so it goes back to that. Even though each species is different, if you just do something, there's enough overlap, you're going to benefit a lot of species. And then again, you can provide all this in a suitable arrangement in your own backyard, which was going to increase the number of animals that you'll get there. And then here's a few photo tips. Before I go any further, does anyone have any questions about anything I've talked about so far? Food, water, cover, anything like that? Any specific photo questions about any of the slides that we've looked at so far, or any of the pictures I've taken and how I went about taking them? I'd be glad to break that down as well. Okay, so if no one has any questions, let's go ahead and move on to photo tips. So I mentioned this a little bit before, but arrange your perches if you're going to start the process of managing for birds in your own backyard. Arrange your perches where you take advantage of early morning or late evening light. Again, I say that in real general terms because everyone's backyard is different. It's oriented different. But if you've got a place that looks better in the morning, arrange your habitat elements in that place where you're going to be able to take advantage of that early morning light, or the same thing is true in late in the evening. Now, this is a thing that I plan to do a lot more of this year. Grow flowers or bring in potted plants to add color to otherwise bland backgrounds. So if your background may be just a privacy fence, you can add color to that by growing sunflowers along the edge of your fence, or just bringing in potted plants and hanging them from the fence. And because it's out of focus, you may not be able to see a whole lot of detail in the pots or how it's hung, but you can see that color. And there's a lot of these pictures that you see that I took in this presentation that have, well, sort of, in my opinion, bland colors. Let me go forward from here, and I'll show you a few examples. That one's not bad. I like the green in that one. A lot of these that I showed you today were like that one, where they were kind of brown, and I never really did added much to the background. And even these, the backgrounds to me are nice, but the colors are pretty bland. But it would have been easy for me. That one, the background's not bad. It'd be easy for me to pre-think about it and add something of a little bit of color in the background. I've even seen hummingbird photographers, which is ingenious, and I've done a little bit of this on other projects I've worked on, where they'll take poster board and just put splotches of color on it and then make that the background. So even though it's in the background and it'll be out of focus, you won't be able to tell much detail about it, but it adds just enough of that kind of artificial bokeh to be able to provide color in an image like you see here of this mourning dove. There's just not a whole lot of color in the background. Background looks nice, but it might look a little nicer if it had a little bit of yellow or something like up here in one of the corners. And then Sue says, I'm not sure what she meant by that, especially good for a natural hummingbird food source. Oh, I think you're talking about planting flowers and stuff. So yeah, that's exactly right. And so again, one of the photo tips, if you grow flowers and stuff, is something with color in your own backyard, not only will you improve your backgrounds, but it also gives you another species, plant species, and something pretty that you can practice your photographic skills on year round. And then here's a big thing for me. If you decide to feed birds, feed year round, because they'll become a little bit dependent. Just like if I've got a big oak tree on my property, and that thing produces a lot of acorns every year, wildlife is going to get accustomed to coming to that tree every year and to be able to eat from it, eat the bounty that tree provides. And so if you're the one providing the bounty in your own backyard, in suburban, wherever, one thing I tell everybody to do is, if you decide to feed, only feed them high quality food, stuff you can go buy from a local feed store, and then no, oops, hang on a second. There we go. Only something you can buy in the local feed store, but don't feed them bread or any kind of scraps like that. Only feed them high quality food that they can digest accordingly. Having some issues here. So, okay, there we go. Now this video I'm going to show you, first time I've tried to show a video on this platform, so I think the sound will work. But this video I'm going to show you is a little backyard habitat project I did at my own house, in the house where I used to live. So we'll see if this works. Just a few minutes into the sit, and I've already seen a ton of wildlife out of this water hole. I had an armadillo come in to get a drink of water. Western meadowlarks, mockingbirds, cardinals, some birds I don't even know what they are, have all came in to get a drink of water. I hear northern flicker outside the blind right now. I'm hoping some quail will come by, and even a roadrunner. I've seen them at this water hole lately. But this water hole, what makes it so attractive to the wildlife is it may be the only one for a few hundred acres around. And so they're all flocking to here to get a drink of water before they go off to bed for the night. But here's the crazy part. I'm right in my own backyard. When you live in a semi-arid climate, water isn't inherently abundant. So when I built my house, I was dismayed at all the water that ran off the roof in a rainstorm. That water just ran off into the pasture and wasn't necessarily providing much of a benefit to the wildlife on the property. Now for walking literally 50 feet from my back door and setting up on this water hole, this has really been a tough day to beat, or a tough afternoon to beat. I've seen all kinds of little songbirds coming to drink water. Saw an armadillo early on, got some good pictures of him. I've been seeing a roadrunner come into this water hole and hoping he would come back, but I never saw him come back today. Roadrunner's a little bit skittish. He might have seen this blind and shied away from it, but these small birds didn't seem to mind. I set up the blind, came back about 5 minutes later with my gear. They were all back into the brush, and then as soon as I settled in the blind, they all flew back in. So sun's getting low. The light's really great right now. I maybe have about 10 or 15 minutes left of good light to photograph before all the birds go to bed. So I'm hoping the roadrunner still comes. I'm hoping some bald-white quail come and drink out of here, because again, I saw some earlier today, about 10 of them. They were all lined up next to each other drinking water, and that'll be a really cool shot if I can ever get it. But I'll definitely be back here a lot more often. You know, setting up a place in the backyard is just a real good opportunity. Whether you live in town or live in the country like I do, it's just a real good opportunity to get wildlife in. Whether you've got a feeder or whether you've got a water source, they're going to come eat, they're going to come drink, and it's just given me a lot of good photographic opportunities today. At my house, I diverted the water from the roof through underground drainage pipes that flow the rainwater from the roof into the pond. The result is a small oasis in an otherwise dry area. As a result, the wildlife flocks to the pond. On any given day, I see deer, turkeys, pigs, coyotes, a host of songbirds, armadillos, and rabbits drinking water from around the edge. The fun part is trying to guess what we'll see next. All right, I think in that project I just showed you, a little ambitious. I mean, I know everyone can't do that, but and so that pond I built was huge. It was probably, I don't know, 200 or 300 square feet in size. But I had the space to do it. But you know, again, if you have just a little small backyard koi pond or just a bird bath or something else that's going to provide water for wildlife, that was the key limiting factor in my area. And so, as you think about backyard bird photography, and you think about what it takes to attract birds to your backyard so you can photograph them, one of the things that's key to think about is kind of doing analysis and what's lacking. You know, you may have a you may have a little koi pond or something else already in the backyard, or a bird bath, but if you lack food, that food's going to be the limiting factor that's going to bring them there. So as you think about the animals and you watch the animals and kind of learn them, they'll let you know what they're lacking. And but again, it's a rewarding way, and it's something that I've just started on as far as from a small time scale. I've been doing it on a bigger scale on my property for a while, but in terms of really trying to make an effort to photograph this stuff without just having to go very far from my house is one of the things I'm really keen on. And these are some of the strategies I've used to be successful so far. Does anybody have any other questions for me as we go through this? Okay. Well, for more information, you can see there's a link there, and if you lose this link or something, it's a link for the National Wildlife Federation. It's just some strategies and some advice on developing, doing some wildlife gardening in your own backyard. And if you follow that, if you take a look at that link right there, nwf.org/garden-for-wildlife/create. It'll give you some pretty good strategies there. And a lot of this stuff we talked about today, I learned from websites like that early on. And if you have any further questions as we go through, as you get further on into your journey, whether it's about backyard wildlife or gardening for backyard wildlife or backyard bird photography or photography in general, please feel free to send me an email at russell@russellgraves.com. And as others in the group can tell you, sometimes I get a little behind on returning emails, but I almost always return emails. And I say almost always because I might have forgotten one or two in the past, but I try to be pretty diligent in responding to any questions that I get sent. So feel free to reach out. I think we had a couple of questions come in. Heather says, I see you're shooting on a gimbal. I'd love to try one. Yeah, gimbals, by the way, Heather, are really nice for big lenses. That they just help stabilize that lens and help make them easier to balance and easier to move. And they've been a big help for me since I've had one for probably maybe 15 years. But they've been a big help for me to get a lot of shots that I probably otherwise couldn't have gotten. And then Sue says the Audubon Society also has suggestions for native plants to attract birds, and they do, and that's a good point. Native plants are always the best plants in which to plant, and every area has plants that thrive different in their area. Where I used to live, mesquite trees and yucca and prickly pear thrive because of a semi-arid climate. But where I live now, oak trees and ash trees and cottonwoods, it's a wetter area and they thrive more. And so one of the things I'm constantly trying to do, and it helps me out as a naturalist, not only as a photographer, but as a naturalist, one thing I'm always trying to do is learn plants that I don't already know, and just helps me be better at being a good steward for wildlife and being, because if I'm a good steward for wildlife, it makes my job as a wildlife photographer be a lot easier. Jerry said, best I've seen on the subject. Thank you. Thank you, Jerry. That's awfully nice for you to say. And then Laurie asked, can you tell us about the hide you're using? Yeah, and I should have mentioned that. I think I mentioned that on one of the slides I had on the photo tips. I think I just glossed over that. Or maybe, yeah, right there, buy a blind. And so in the video, you see that I was using a blind. And the blinds I use, you can go to Bass Pro Shops and buy them, and that's usually where I get mine from. They're just a little pop-up blind that a single person can set in. They cost probably $60 or $70. They're not real expensive, but they go up really quick and they take down really quick. And there's also a company now called Tragopan, and it's Tragopan. That is, Tragopan is making photography-specific blinds, but they're a little more expensive. But those little single-person pop-up blinds, I feel like, work pretty good for what I need them for. And then just a few. Thank you, James, for your message there. And then Ashton says, at the very beginning of your presentation, there was a dove in flight, looked like a strobe was used. I think you're talking about that one. Can you talk about that? Yeah, so sometimes serendipity plays a little bit of role in being able to get nice photographs. And when I took this picture, there wasn't a strobe used. First of all, I'm not a huge fan of using strobes in wildlife photography. I've done it before, but I'm just typically not a real, me personally, and this is just kind of my creative sensibilities. I'm not a real big fan of just the way it looks. Other people can make it look great. I've just never been able to. But this bird here was actually one of the things I did on my property was created just a little wheat field, just wheat like they make bread from. And but I grew mine. It was probably 2,000 square feet in size, and it would attract wildlife to come eat on the wheat, the young wheat, and then it would grow up and make seeds. And I had my own little, natural bird feeder out there that I could photograph from. And so that time of year, turkeys would always show up. And so I was out there actually photographing turkeys. And one dove flew in and landed in front of me, and I missed it. And then I happened to see another dove sitting in the tree using the loafing cover. It was just resting there. And when it got ready to fly down, literally, I pointed the camera at it and it locked autofocus quick enough. And I shot 3 pictures of that bird landing. And that was, to me, that was probably the most dynamic one. I just like the tail feathers fanned out, and I like the pose of the wings and all that. And again, sometimes you get lucky, Ashton, and that's the case in this picture right there. Well, after you saw the video, you can tell some of the pictures like this one right here, they were taken at my little backyard watering hole that I made for wildlife. This one was taken there too. And all I did when I built that was just went around and on some neighbors' properties and picked up a bunch of rocks, and I bought a little bit of rock from the concrete company in town to fill in the gaps and made the water hole. That picture was right there around the water hole. A lot of these pictures you see were right there close to that water hole. That picture was by the water hole. Because every day, especially in the summertime, there'd just be birds and armadillos and all kinds of animals coming in to drink out of that. Brenda asked, what settings do you use, and do you shoot in RAW? I do shoot in RAW. Of course, the settings I use are typically depending on the lighting conditions of the picture that I took. But in general, I can tell you this. I shared this a couple of weeks ago on a webinar. I can tell you empirically, 80% of the pictures I've ever taken, because I've crunched the data, 80% of the pictures I've ever taken, I took them on aperture priority mode with my cameras. And so I shoot aperture priority mode 80% of the time. I shoot manual about 15% of the time. But aperture priority, most likely on all these, my sweet spot on ISO is between 400 and 800. So I can probably tell you that most of these pictures were shot in that range as well. And then usually I try to shoot as wide open as aperture as I can get, like these, like that lens you saw me using in the video is a 500 millimeter lens. I had a 1.4 teleconverter on it, so it makes it like a 720, I think, if my math is correct, which is probably not. So if you want to check me on my math, feel free to tell me if I'm wrong on that. But I think it makes it 720 millimeter at f5.6, and so likely most all these pictures were taken at f5.6 or at f8, just one or two stops from being wide open. Because again, like this picture here, I just like those really out of focus backgrounds. And by the way, while we're on the subject, if you look at this background here, that background to this dove is relatively far off, which gives you that really out of focus background, nondescript background. And if you look at, well, let me back up a little more. There's a good illustration because the rock is tilting up and away from the water. The rock in relation to the turkey is not that far away, and so the rock is even more distinct just because of the distance, like we talked about earlier. The distance of the background from the subject really makes a huge difference in the way the background looks. But I couldn't do any better there, so that's the absolutely best we could do. But the background is not distracting. But if I had a background like the mourning dove, for this picture, it'd be even better for me. But you can see there, that's a good illustration. Some of the limbs of that mesquite tree are not very far behind that painted bunting, and so they're not really out of focus, but the background at large is even further back, so it's really soft and out of focus. Brenda asked a good question. Let me get a little further in this, Brenda, and I'm going to get back to that one link, and I'll tell you that answer, because I'll tell you how I built that thing. I wish I had a still photo of it on this presentation so we could talk about it more. So I dug that hole for that water hole. Probably I dug it with my little compact tractor that I've got. It was probably a couple of feet deep at the deepest, because I wanted to build it a singular depth, but I couldn't really accomplish that because of topography and because of just the limitations I had with the tractor I was using. And so it's probably a couple of feet deep at the deepest. But what you can't see is, let me go past that. What you can't see is underneath all that rock is I put a liner in it so it would be more efficient at holding water. So if I just dumped all the water out on the dirt would soak up most of it, and it just would hardly ever hold water. And so by putting a liner in it, I was able to retain water longer, and which is really key for getting wildlife to come in. And so I just covered the liner up with rocks just to hide it. Now, some of the bottom, you could still see the liner down there in the underwater, but for the most part, you couldn't. And the crazy thing about the liner I use, you can go buy rubber from these pond supply companies, but it was pretty expensive. And so I found a place online that recycled trade show tarps. You know, you go into a trade show and you see these gigantic tarps hanging on the walls, and they're selling some kind of product. And I actually bought one of those from that company, and so I think I paid $50 for this. I think it was probably 30 feet by 60 feet, something like that. This huge trade show tarp, but it was from a photography trade show, so it had a giant camera right in the middle. And then when people would fly over and they could see the bottom of it, they could see the camera underwater. Because I flew over my house a couple of times, and that's when I noticed it. You can see the camera underwater in the bottom of that pond. And so I can't remember the name of the company, but if you look at like used trade show tarps, they work pretty good for using as a liner for a pond, and that way you can recycle that material as well as it did a great job. It was probably about as durable as a rubber liner. I mean, the whole time I was there, I probably had, before I sold that house and moved and bought the new place, it probably had it there 5 years, and it was durable, and deer would walk down in it and they never punctured it. So it always worked out pretty well. And again, the way it supplied water, it just reminds you, is almost entirely supplied by, every time it would rain, water would run off the roof, run into the gutters, and I had the gutters piped underground to flow into the pond. And so it would capture all the rainfall off my roof. And you may not know this, but for every 1,000 square feet of roof space you have, an inch of rain will produce about 625 gallons of water. And so calculate your roof size. My roof was bigger than 1,000 square foot in the house that you saw in that video. And I think I had almost 2,000 square feet of roof. And so 2,000 square feet of roof, every inch of rain, it produced 100 or 1,200 gallons of water roughly. And then times that by about 24 inches of rain a year. And that one roof captured a lot of water from it. And so that was a rainfall storage. You know, the old timers here in Texas used to build cisterns that they would store water in when the times would get dry. And essentially I built an outdoor system that I would store rainfall water in, and provided a benefit to wildlife in my area, and provided a benefit to me just as a constant source of photography subjects. So hope that helps, Brenda. And if your husband, give me his phone number and I'll call him and encourage him for you to help you, because it's pretty cool when you can build something like that. Okay, I'm going to put that information back up again. There's the National Wildlife Federation website for if you want to learn more about backyard habitats for wildlife, and then there's my email address if you have any more questions for me. But it's 12:53. We're about done with our hour. If no one has any further questions, I'll wait for just a second. But if no one has any further questions, I just want to say thanks again for joining us. I'm about to head to Alaska for a little while to go on a Backcountry Journeys tour on Northern Lights and bald eagles up there. So when I get back, I'll be doing another webinar. I believe it's it's 2 weeks from today. I think it is. I think it's on the 30th, but it's kind of a recap of my recent trip to the Florida Everglades, just kind of a slideshow and talking through some of the pictures. So hope you'll join me on that. Hope you'll join us again in the future. And I don't see any further questions coming in, so appreciate everyone's attention. And again, just if you think of anything after this webinar is over, follow up with me. Okay, here's a question. Pat says, what advice do you have for catching birds in flight? I've got a whole presentation about that I've done before, and I'll usually do it on the birds in flight tours that we do. But my advice is pretty simple. I can make this pretty straightforward. Number one, use a higher ISO, like ISO 800. I don't try to go 3200 or something like that, but ISO 800 in bright skies will usually give me a fast enough shutter speed. Number two, and this is a key thing a lot of people don't think about, most telephoto lenses, well, I say most, I know a lot of telephoto lenses I see have a focus limiter on the side of the lens. And what that focus limiter does is instead of that lens having to hunt through its entire focal range, you can limit it to only focus like, say, 15 meters and beyond. And I'm no optical physicist, and I can't tell you why you do this, but if you look at your lens and you look at the scale, most of the focusing movement is between the close-up focus and 15 meters. If you get beyond 15 meters, there's just a little sliver of space that lens needs to move to obtain focus. And that's one of the key things there on birds in flight. You can set that focus limiter where that lens isn't trying to hunt through its whole range. And when it's not trying to hunt through its whole range of focusing, it'll lock on flying birds a lot better. And then the third advice to give you is pick a bird when they're far out and start tracking them all the way in and stay with that same bird. It's hard to do when you're in an area where a lot of birds are flying around, but if you'll stick with one bird until it lands and then go pick another bird, your shots go way up. So I always advise people to pick one early, watch it all the way in, and then take pictures of it as it comes in, and just lay down on the button as it comes in. Take lots and lots and lots of pictures. And if you can follow those four main things, use like a 800 ISO, set the focus limiter, pick a bird early and stick with it, and then shoot lots of frames. I never get 100% of birds in focus perfectly, but it certainly increases my the number of keepers that I have later on. And the fifth thing really is just practice. Practice a lot before you even get out there. And that practice may be the dog running around your yard or neighborhood birds like we've been talking about today, but the practice is really the key thing. All right. Well, hey, again, thanks, guys, for having me and being with me today. And if there's no further questions, I'm going to go ahead and run. I think if you'll check back, I don't know how often they or how quick they turn these around, but the good folks back at the Backcountry Journeys offices will post these to the Backcountry Journeys YouTube channel. And if you need to follow up, but again, if you have any other questions, just send me an email. I'll be glad to help. Take care, guys.